Welcome to the Indian Council of World Affairs, India's oldest foreign policy think tank.
Many people interested in foreign policy have told me when they come to the Indian Council of World Affairs in Sapru House, they feel a great sense of affinity with this institution because this was where the serious study of international relations in India all began.
The ICWA was set up by a small group of public intellectuals some years before our independence because they felt it important that India have an independent perspective on international affairs. Since then, the ICWA has gone from strength to strength, and it has been a long journey, almost 75 years. One particular milestone in that journey was in 2001, when the Indian Parliament passed an act declaring the ICWA to be an institution of national importance. We thus became a publicly funded independent think tank. Our governing council is headed by the Vice President of India, and the External Affairs Minister is its Vice President. We have three focus areas. The first is research, which is carried out by an in-house faculty. Very rigorous research on different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank and being close to policy, commenting on policy and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I for many years have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy, that it has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries, and books on foreign affairs by not only former diplomats and established academics but also by upcoming scholars. Our journal India Quarterly is being published since 1945. ICWA's publications are also being translated into various Indian languages. What is ICWA's role as we move into the future? The vision of the institution is to stay abreast of all the momentous changes taking place in the domain of foreign policy. New areas are emerging. There are strategic technologies, there is climate change, there is artificial intelligence, and there is cyber security. How can our research faculty and the audiences that come here be better informed about developments in these areas? How can we write and formulate research papers to give policy inputs that help in government policy formulation? These are the emerging challenges for ICWA and form a part of our vision for the future.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the book discussion of ICWA publication, Status of European Integration Possible Trajectory, by late Professor Purusottam Bhattacharya. The book is situated in the context of global maelstrom that makes up the contemporary reality. It is a critical stock-taking of important milestones and debates that have marked the long journey of evolution of the European Union. The book explores whether an existential crisis has truly gripped the Union and how its trajectory of growth is likely to evolve. It also explores questions like, can the EU survive, and if so, in what shape and form? Or will it disintegrate? Then what would be the nature of post-EU Europe? Before we begin, some ground rules. All speakers and panelists are requested to mute themselves when they are not speaking. Questions will be taken during Q&A session. Panelists can ask questions to the speakers live through raise hand option, and questions can also be asked by our registered attendees live by typing through chat box. Questions have to be kept brief and to the point. To begin, I now invite Professor Anindya Jyoti Majumdar, Professor and Head, Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, to give his remarks on life and work of Professor Purusottam Bhattacharya. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Ankita. Let me begin by saying that I have mixed feelings today. I am happy that discussion session is being arranged by ICWA on Professor Purusottam Bhattacharya's last work. And I am also a bit sad because he is no longer with us. I, however, consider myself privileged to have this opportunity to place before you a brief account of Professor Purusottam Bhattacharya's life and works. Born in 1950, Professor Purusottam Bhattacharya graduated from Presidency College, Kolkata, and obtained a BSc in Economics with International Relations as a special subject from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Subsequently, he received his MPhil and PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Purusottam Bhattacharya was a former professor of international relations, a former director, School of International Relations and Strategic Studies, and a former head, Department of International Relations at Jadavpur University, Kolkata. He also served as a reader in international studies at Pondicherry University between 1988 and 1990, and taught at Burdwan and Vidyasagar universities in the 1980s and 1990s in West Bengal. He was a visiting research fellow in the School of International Studies and Law, Coventry University in the UK. He also visited UK and Belgium on a research grant from the University Grants Commission. Professor Bhattacharya was a participant fellow of Salzburg Seminar, Austria. He visited a number of American universities and research institutions, including Harvard and Columbia. He also participated in roundtable discussion on the foreign policy of the European Union in the eyes of its strategic partners, organized by the European Studies Unit of Department of International Relations, London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Bhattacharya was a participant in an international seminar on European Union and Asia in Warsaw, Poland. In fact, Professor Bhattacharya has participated and presented papers in a number of seminars and conferences here in India and abroad. And as the author, co-editor, editor of almost 10 books, Purusottam Bhattacharya contributed a large number of research papers and articles to edited volumes and in national and international journals. He was also a regular participant in TV and radio programs commenting on international affairs. Professor Bhattacharya breathed his last in March 2020, but during the previous year, he was engaged in researching and writing on European integration and Brexit, under the auspices of Indian Council of World Affairs. And this book for discussion that we have today is the outcome of that particular project. Though Europe and Britain was the main area of focus of Professor Bhattacharya, he wrote extensively on Indian foreign policy, on security issues, including environmental and human security. In fact, he has shown inclination to write on Indo-Pacific, on China, South Asia. So, in fact, he has written a lot on number of issues, though I must admit that at his heart was Europe and, of course, Britain. Professor Bhattacharya was a sincere scholar, a competent and popular teacher, and a dependable colleague. I have worked with him on numerous occasions. We have co-authored articles, we have co-edited books. We have organized, in the university on behalf of the department, refresher courses, seminars, conferences, and always I found him to be very serious and meticulous and a very cooperative kind of person. Above everything else, he was a nice human being, and he is still missed by his students and colleagues. I'm glad that one of his last works has come up for discussion today, and I thank the participants, ICWA, the chair and the speakers for coming together to make this event possible. Thank you very much. He was a very close colleague, and of course it is a kind of occasion, as I have just said in the beginning, it brings mixed feelings to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Majumdar, for your remarks. Before we move on to the book discussion, let me present a brief overview of the book. Professor Purusottam Bhattacharya's book, Status of European Integration Possible Trajectory, presents an overview of where European integration process stands at the close of second decade of 21st century. The book tries to answer several fundamental questions that have been raised over the years, like where does EU go from here? Does the EU now suffer from an existential crisis? What kind of reforms are required so that EU may adapt itself to the changed situation that it finds itself in? What should be EU's response to a Europe and a world where globalization seems to be on the retreat? And finally, where is EU headed in short and long term? The author has tried to provide answers to these pertinent questions through a substantive stock-taking of what has been achieved in the past 7 decades. He takes a relook at the basic objectives of European project as they were envisaged at its inception. The idea of European integration was launched in 1952 with the establishment of European Coal and Steel Community with the 6 like-minded states of Western Europe. The founding fathers of the European project envisaged that this community of 6 countries would eventually incorporate the entire European continent. To some extent, this vision has been realized, with the EU welcoming new member states over the decades, with Croatia becoming the 28th member of the EU in 2013. Correspondingly, the boundaries of the European Union's integration agendas were also greatly expanded with creation of several autonomous institutions, common policies, and other activity areas. The book has a total of 7 chapters. The first 3 chapters of the book look at the basic objectives of the European integration movement. They focus on genesis of the European community and the Union, taking a critical look at the process of integration by highlighting its ups and downs and the compromises that have gone down in shaping this union. And it also concentrates on the evolution of European Union as a critical international actor in the past decade. The chapter 4 focuses on establishment and development of India-European Union relations from its nascent stage to the strategic partnership that we witness today. Chapter 5 and 6 are the most significant chapters of the book, as they focus on 6 major elements that have contributed to the crisis that the Union faces. These are the issues of Brexit, national vis-a-vis transnational identities, sovereign debt crisis, security issues including terrorism and EU's fraught relations with Russia, migration, and finally climate change and European responses to it. The final chapter gives a comprehensive account of findings of the research done in the book and a thinking around where Europe stands today and how the future may be. While taking the stock of achievements of European integration project and the roadmap that it set out for itself, there is no doubt that the primary objective of attaining peace among the warring nations of the continent have been achieved. The European Union today has emerged as a very powerful international actor, primarily drawing its heft as a trading superpower, but also as an effective voice in global affairs. The ECSC was only a beginning of the construction of Union's elaborate structures and institutions, which have subsequently come to define its existence over the next 7 decades. The Treaty of Rome, which led to the foundation of European Economic Community in 1957, became the building block over which this intricate edifice of the Union was created. As the integration gathered momentum, it generated its own dynamics with the widening sphere of activities through building of autonomous common institutions, adoption of common policies, which gave European Union its own distinctive identity and jurisdiction. Starting with the coal and steel community and a common market, the process of building the Union continued with formulation of several policies in key areas like agriculture, transport, competition, etc., and the competence to take decisions in these areas was progressively transferred from the domestic to the Union jurisdiction through succession of treaties. These actions are outcome of lengthy processes of negotiations. The community, which became European Union in 1993, was faced with the classic dilemma of deepening versus widening, as enlargement into Central and Eastern Europe became crucial as these states transitioned to liberal democracies and market economies and had to be taken on board. As the Union has discovered in past 15 years, integrating these countries whose polities and economies were very different into the Union system of structure with its very distinctive requirements and imperatives has been a painstaking and a time-consuming process. However, in the second decade of 21st century, EU seems to be stuck in a kind of a quagmire of complexities, ranging from Eurozone crisis to migration crisis, issues related to European identity, rise of right-wing politics, climate change, and security issues. The dilemma now, as the book highlights, is how to fix these many inadequacies of the EU political system as it grapples with these bewildering challenges. These crises have raised certain fundamental existential questions, the most prominent being whether the level of integration that has been achieved was now being contested by people of the member state themselves, who, it has been argued in the book, felt that too much power had been accrued in Brussels and that it was now time for a looser organization. Therefore, one can also ask another question, like whether the roadmap of integration, as it was envisaged during Maastricht's treaty process, has reached its limit and a new way forward now needs to be chalked out. Keeping this background in mind, the book has sought to provide a very comprehensive account of the European integration processes and what kind of possible trajectory it will take in 21st century. The European Union, no doubt, is at a crossroads today, and in the words of the author, in a world which is witnessing increasing manifestations of the eclipse of reason and slide toward tribalism and identity politics, the liberal democratic order based on rule of law and basic rights seems to be endangered. The convulsions of the past decades have unsettled European societies to such an extent that individuals who live in these societies now fear for their present and future existence. Parts of societies in many of these EU member states are now losing faith in collective future and seeking a return to full national sovereignty, as though a return to past will be an answer for all the ills of the present. While acknowledging this perspective, it is equally important to acknowledge that the relevance of the EU in the 21st century as the bulwark against the ills that plagues the Europeans is still as strong as ever. The book concludes with the idea that although EU's achievements till date are unquestionable, its limitations too have been noted. The overriding necessity for the EU today is now to reform And change as the world of today is not as same as the world of late 1940s and 50s. This is also an overwhelming consensus among experts of European integrations, as well as ordinary European citizens who still recognizes the utility of the Union as its continued existence. According to author, the EU does not face any immediate existential crisis or any threat of disintegration if it chooses to act wisely, taking stock of all these warning trends and then progresses along the path of reform and change. It has many options that it must weigh carefully and act accordingly. If it does, its relevance and continuity will be assured in a world which is recognized by its volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. To conclude, the most important thing that needs to be remembered while talking about European integration is that it is almost 7 decades old. The face of Europe today, as compared to the time when the process started, is completely transformed. The scholars of the EU acknowledge that Europe today faces very serious challenges, but there is no denying that it remains an economic and political powerhouse. Professor Bhattacharya, in his book, has provided a kind of a sneak peek into this extremely complex process of integration that European Union has gone through, is going through, and will have to go through in the near future. To discuss these various facets of European integration and its future trajectories, we have with us today a very eminent panel. The discussions today will be chaired by Mr. Krishnan Srinivasan, former Foreign Secretary of India, and our panelists are Professor Shibashis Chatterjee, Professor, Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University, and Professor Gulshan Sachdeva, Professor, Center for European Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. So I now request Mr. Srinivasan to kindly deliver his opening remarks and conduct the proceedings. Sir, over to you. Sir, you have to unmute. Sir, you have to unmute yourself.
Now I'm sure you can hear me. Can you?
Yes, sir.
Good. Now, unfortunately, I think there's some connectivity problems in my flat, but I hope I can stay with you for the rest of this program. Firstly, I'd like to thank the ICWA very much, and also Professor Majumdar for their invitation to be here on this program. It's a great pleasure to be here, especially when remembering Professor Bhattacharya. I met Professor Bhattacharya at Jadavpur University around 2005, and a few times after that. I can't honestly say that he was a friend of mine, but I knew him as a very fluent lecturer, a dedicated teacher, deeply interested in Europe, and at the LSE, which was mentioned by Professor Majumdar, he had been supervised, I think, by Christopher Hill, who memorably coined the still valid phrase, capability expectations gap. Professor Bhattacharya writes that there are very few Indian scholars of European history. This is unfortunately true. He was one of the few, and I think that accordingly his book, though sadly posthumous, is very welcome. I'd like to pay tribute to his memory. This book has, Dr. Dutta has told us, traces with very great detail the origin and history of the evolving EU. And this will prove an invaluable textbook for those who wish to seek such details. He also explicates the various problems that the EU finds itself in. Though his death obviously precluded a view of the ravages, both medical and political, of COVID-19 and the early negative outcomes of Brexit. Europe, the European Union, and the Eurozone are three quite distinct entities. Europe may or may not extend to the Urals, but the European Union certainly does not. And the European Monetary Union has only 19 members. The EU, in other words, is a very strange and unique animal in the jungle of international relations. It is nowhere near a unified superstate, and nationhood remains important. EU members are both nation states and member states, and the European Union simultaneously represents itself and also the 27 members. The EU holds a seat, sometimes controversially, on the G20, and is also a permanent observer at the United Nations. Though I must say it rarely has much to say in either of these bodies. The EU lacks natural resources, clear external borders, has north-south and east-west tensions, a budget that supports inefficient agriculture. It's the number 3 world polluter and is unable to solve periphery conflicts in Ukraine, Bosnia, Georgia, Kosovo, or Armenia. It strikes a high moral posture, often to its disadvantage, in dealing with the developing world. In security matters, its leading member, which is Germany, is specifically disposed, and it relies on the United States for defense. The whole arrangement with separate competencies is hard to understand. Competencies between the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament. And if it's hard to understand for Europeans, it's doubly hard to understand for non-Europeans. However, and this is an important however, the European Union is the world's largest trading entity in goods, and it is a lifestyle superpower, with 20 out of the 30 top places habitually and consistently in the United Nations Human Development Report. Purusottam Bhattacharya's chapter on India-EU relations will obviously be of special interest to us. Before COVID-19 and Brexit, the EU had about the same GDP as the United States and was one of India's major trade and investment partners. India also had a rather unique position in that it had an advantageous balance of trade in services, one of the few countries to do so. Being the largest democracies and confederal unions of linguistically, culturally, ethnically diverse states, both the EU and India are well suited for a special relationship. But the reality is that the situation is one without any spark of mutual chemistry. A loveless arranged marriage between suitable parties comes to mind. India and the EU have other things in common. They have both institutions, both India and the EU are bureaucratic, unwieldy, indecisive, struggle with central federal tensions, and the challenge of less developed regions and multiple identities. Except for Germany and France, India has a fairly low profile in the European Union, as does the European Union here in India. And after Brexit, and with the departure of Britain, India's strongest historical link and optic to the EU and for investments and demography have been removed. The Comprehensive Trade Agreement, which was negotiated first in 2007 and subsequently in fits and starts, is as far away as ever. In the end, it's very probable that both sides will settle on a very diminished compromise. In short, the EU for India is both a challenge and an opportunity. The innumerable problems facing individual states and the EU itself are laid out in Purusottam Bhattacharya's book and has been very capably summarized by Dr. Dutta. No member wants to leave the EU, and a few outliers still want to join it. But problems within are growing. Hungary and Poland are under fire from Brussels. Greece has been in and out of the doghouse. The EU faces resistance, from migrants to rule of law to passing the budget, and is now torn apart by mismanagement of Brexit. Eurosceptics certainly no longer wish to leave the Union, but they wish to prevent closer union from within. And many mainstream political parties in Europe are now adopting some populist policies. While the book's title refers to integration and possible trajectories, and probably due to Professor Bhattacharya's death, the last chapter of 10 pages, headed Whither Integration, gives us very little guidance on the pathways ahead. So for this and other aspects, I think we should now turn to the panelist specialists, Professor Chatterjee and Professor Sachdeva. To start with, let's have the pleasure of listening to Shibashis Chatterjee. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Srinivasan, and let me at the outset express my heartfelt gratitude and thanks to ICWA. Because frankly, I think this is almost nearly an impossibility turned into a possibility. Okay, I mean, I must at the outset say that I don't qualify to be as a panelist for the simple reason that I'm not a Europe person by any stretch of imagination. I've never written anything on Europe. I've never even sort of written a commentary, let's say, on the European Union, okay, in the newspaper or anywhere. So I don't really qualify. My sole, I think, the sole reason why I see myself here is because of the fact that I was inextricably intertwined with the maturation, let's say, of the project. Because of the fact that Professor Bhattacharya was not only a dear colleague of mine, but he was also a very dear professor of mine. Okay, I mean, so I had the benefit of being his undergrad and postgrad teacher at Jadavpur University. And like many of his work, particularly when it came to this task, well, I was, in a sense, I was a part of it because Professor Bhattacharya had many discussions on the book and the challenges that he faced with regard to it. Okay, I mean, so I feel personally, as Anindya in fact had said, both very happy and very sad. Happy because the book in fact had seen the light of the day, and I'm very thankful to the director of ICWA, Dr. Raghavan. I'm very thankful to Vivek. I kept on badgering him, writing to him that please tell me what exactly is happening with the book. Because there's an issue of sentiment attached to it. Okay, I mean, posthumous publications, in fact, are touchy, they're sensitive, and we have to therefore place it in the right context. So it's not merely, for me at least, it is not essentially an intellectual dissection that I'm in a sense engaged with. And I reiterate the fact with the permission of Ambassador Srinivasan that I don't have the capability or the competence, in fact, to engage in this task. But I take this opportunity to say something on the book, because not only because of the fact that I had the occasion of reading it, but also I was a part of the project in senses more than one. So, my take is as follows. So, a lifelong student of European Union in general and European Union relations in particular, Professor Purusottam Bhattacharya was greatly animated by what was happening in the continent and remained active in the debates as a participant throughout his writings on the subject. When his retirement from service was nearing, he had started to plan a book on European integration. His original idea was to bring together some of his published work on the subject in one cover, update the text empirically, and write a suitable introduction and conclusion. However, he realized rather quickly that there was scope to write afresh on the subject, and he prepared himself to take up the challenge of doing a book project with ICWA. He was a firm believer that a good book cannot be written from a distance, and proximity and situatedness were necessary virtues of any intellectual endeavor. In many of our conversations in the planning of the book, which mostly happened in his place or at the cafe by his home, he would emphasize on the need to talk to serving EU officials, statesmen, academicians, and people from the other walks of life, to get a pulse of what was happening, how they thought of the situation on ground, their experiences, aspirations, insecurities, and ambiguities. I must emphasize this clearly here today, that the field trips he took to select European states in lieu of his work was the most fascinating aspect of the work, according to him. Despite his health issues and some misplaced doubts as to whether he would succeed in his mission, intellectually and materially, he undertook the visits and spent invaluable time across many states in Europe, collected materials, conducted interviews, watched the scenario keenly, and soaked in as much information and insight as he could. Despite being one of the authorities on the subject, he was always open to criticisms and fresh perspectives. He had some initial trepidation with regard to the eventual status of the manuscript, as the review had resulted in rather extensive comments. However, his unease was solely due to his faltering health. He would often ask me to say dispassionately if he was physically up to it to complete the project. It is no mean achievement and an indication of the determination of the man that he did complete the job. Honestly, many in his condition would have given up on it. I'm not a person who is qualified to review my teacher's book, since I have no systematic reading of the European Union or its associated dynamics. Yet I have had the good fortune of reading the chapters when they were penned, and I was integral to the modifications he effected in response to the extensive comments made by the referees, and reading quickly the published version of the last few, and I read quickly as much as I can the published version in the last few days. Hence, I decided to agree to say a few things, though I'm not qualified in this role. We remained in conversation on his subject of interest or passion from the early 1990s, when I was his student in class. Let me say this clearly, that his book bears a testimony to his central concerns, and my task is to say briefly reflect on a select few of these concerns. I found 5 questions to have animated Professor Bhattacharya in his lifelong commitments to European politics. And these, in fact, are something that I also find in the book. These are the role of history, the limitations of power politics and the attractions for functionalism, a keen awareness of the challenges of extremist politics bedeviling European integration from within, the need to reflect on the challenges of the integration, both in institutional and process terms, and Europe and more specifically Britain's ties with India. If one reads this book carefully, one would see these themes correlating the text one way or the other. Allow me to say a few words on these themes, though through his perspective. To be honest, not everything I will say is verbally located in the text. But if we read in between lines sensitively, we will not have much difficulty in locating them. The role of history is the first point that I draw your attention to. The book adopts primarily a historian's approach to understand the process and the challenges to European integration. The present predicament must cast our mind backwards. The book tells us that all judgment on Europe's success and failures must be done in the light of the original mission set forth by the great architects of the integration plan. In fact, it is the dream of regenerating a politically and economically shattered Europe and find a lasting solution to the French-German enmity that triggered the integration process. And these goals, the book tells us through the chapters, have been admirably met. The book repeatedly harps on the need to see the present in the light of the past. I see a lot of A.J.P. Taylor and Hook Trevor Roper in the background. This is a book that reminds us that we must know where we come from to appreciate where we are headed to. Yet it also tells us that all stories of the past are complex. There will never be a seamless narrative to rely on. Hence, the contemporary uncertainties are neither peculiar nor a carbon copy of the past. They require the historian's craft and the awareness of international affairs in equal measures to be understood in their proper perspective. The book also appreciates the functionalist thesis and reminds readers that European realities cannot be understood by uncritically deploying the idea of power politics. The book, however, is not an investment into a realistic utopia. The chapter on the role of Europe as an international actor shows how the politics of integration helped recover Europe's effective voice in global affairs, along with the other major powers of our times, despite the loss of colonial possessions and the destruction of the Second World War. Professor Bhattacharya was a social democrat and a Nehruvian in his foreign policy views, yet he understood the requirements and the enchantments of power. Russian power and its implications for the European project surely appears in the text. Yet they do not exhaust it. This book traverses the classical middle ground, repeatedly emphasizing the need to experiment and not get swayed by fads. His thesis is that we must adequately appreciate the fact that the European Union is not a supranation state. It is an institutional innovation without parallel or sequel. It could not have happened without the logic of functional cooperation and spillover. Europe may have been the birthplace of classical balance of power, yet EU was not a realist imagination. It was an alternative experiment that neither succeeded fully nor failed spectacularly. The book underlies the uniqueness of the process, not a seamless narrative of power or a smooth concatenation of cooperation. To talk of the European project is to extol the virtues of difference. The central problematic of the book is indeed the process of integration itself, which Professor Bhattacharya delineates in great details. The centrality of the Brexit and its implications for Europe must be understood in this light. In fact, still his last, he did not believe that Brexit would reverse the integration process. His central argument was that British political culture was perennially divided on the identity question, with its uniqueness and bonds with the continent creating a fierce dialectics that was far from being over. If the historian in him summoned a detailed account of the events that challenged the integration process, both in Britain and in Europe proper, his deep democratic sensibilities secured the unmistakable optimism that underlies the work. Hence, this book is not about a tragic failure. It is about the challenges which the integration process had to negotiate. He shows without wasting too many pages that the process has witnessed many crises before, and hence there was no reason as to be unduly pessimistic about the present predicament. His thesis is that it is the stultified institutionalism of the process of integration, and not the peculiarities of politics, that explains Europe's crisis. He was hopeful that fresh institutional designs can be found to tide over the crisis. The book also has quite a remarkable point to offer on the rise of the populist right-wing politics both across Europe and beyond. For one, he correctly places the issue in its proper perspective and shows how the political economy of globalization was the larger canvas for this development. In other words, my reading is that he did not believe there was anything peculiarly European about the anti-globalist and Eurosceptic political right. Europe's history shows that the political right were always there, and the expansion of the Union has afforded the perfect context for the accentuation of this trend. His book empirically shows that even at the height of the crescendo, right-wing parties did not perform as well as they were expected. He believed that what ailed Europe was not the form of politics, but the lack of vision. Not populism, but the inability to transcend the many divisions within. European Union did little to resolve the problem of two Europe, and the expansion only weakened the original agreement over policies and destinations. His fear was for the health of democracy, the future of liberalism, the prevarications of welfare commitments, the many fault lines that weakened the pace of integration, the resurgence of parochial nationalism, and the crumbling consciences of the leadership. Yet above all, his book rivets attention to the architectural errors that could not be corrected by the thoughtful leadership. Professor Bhattacharya was a quintessential institutionalist. His book is ultimately a tale of fraught institutionalism. Professor Bhattacharya believed that while India's relations with Europe has improved remarkably in the post-Cold War period, a lot had to be done to cement ties, to take the partnership to a new level, which he took as a normatively desirable goal. I would not comment on his thoughts in this matter because Ambassador Srinivasan, in fact, had already made, I think, very thoughtful intervention on it. And even otherwise, I do not think that this chapter, in fact, is in a way central, let's say, to the book. He describes the contemporary challenges and identifies the convergences and divergences with an admirable attention to details. I think his book tells us, perhaps not in so many words, but in spirit, that the post-colonial moment was also a time of nurturing and understanding, of finding commonalities and accepting of differences, and ultimately reflecting on our domestic preferences in each other's mirrors. Professor Bhattacharya personified these traits. It does not surprise me to see that his last book is not a text of misplaced adventure or foreboding pessimism, but an account of sober reflection of our shared heritages and unique possessions. His passion to see a liberal world order where all can live a dignified life and not shudder at the prospects of thinking out of the box have left their mark throughout the pages. Therefore, without any qualification whatsoever, and without any, I would say, sense of personal attachment whatsoever, I think the book deserves our attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chatterjee. Those were extremely illuminating remarks, and clearly you had much to do with the production of the book itself in the early stages. So can we now turn to Professor Gulshan Sachdeva, and we'll have the benefit of listening to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Srinivasan. And Ambassador T.C. Raghavan, I think he's also there somewhere in the audience. Professor Shibashis Chatterjee, Professor Anindya Jyoti Majumdar, Dr. Ankita Dutta, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is a great occasion when we are discussing the latest book of Professor Purusottam Bhattacharya. And I really feel honored to discuss Professor Bhattacharya's book. And as I think others have also mentioned, I also feel sad that Professor Bhattacharya is not amongst us when we are discussing his work. Professor Bhattacharya was very much part of our Center for European Studies at JNU. He did receive his MPhil and PhD from what earlier used to be West European Studies. And I don't remember any major seminar or conference on Europe organized by our center in the last 10-15 years where Professor Bhattacharya was not a participant. And he was also a PhD examiner of a number of our students. I clearly remember, he was so enthusiastic about this book. After his retirement from Jadavpur University, he was with us for some time as a visiting professor. And that was the time when he was actually working on this project. We had long discussions about some of the themes which we have discussed and the kind of challenges faced by Europe. And that was also the time, I guess, he was also planning his field visit connected to this work to Europe. And then he also kind of consulted with me and my other colleagues, which are the best places to go and how to go about this. There are very few people in India, as mentioned by the chair, who regularly follow Europe. And he was definitely one of those who followed Europeans and particularly British developments very, very carefully. I think because of his background as a student in Britain and later as a scholar of EU and European studies, for the last few years, I think he had developed keen interest in Brexit. If I remember here, in the last few years, he has also written a couple of papers on Brexit. In 2019, when I was editing my book on Indian perspectives on challenges faced by Europe, and I thought at that point of time that you cannot find a better person to write on Brexit than Professor Bhattacharya. I approached him to contribute a chapter on Brexit, and of course he agreed immediately and contributed a very useful paper. For the last few days, I have been reading this book. And every time when I finished a chapter, I realized how deep and systematic understanding Professor Bhattacharya had about the EU project and British role in this project. Now, in the last 10-15 years, I think our ties with the European Union has grown significantly. The EU was always an important trade and investment partner of India. But now things have gone much beyond purely economic issues. But to properly understand, I think some of those issues in the context of what Chair has also mentioned about competencies within the EU institutions and between the EU institutions and member states, we do need a fine understanding of the working of EU institutions, their competencies, national politics, and as well as also EU politics. Most people in India think, or most scholars in India think that they know about EU. I'm not underestimating their knowledge and their capabilities. But after following EU-related issues now for more than 2 decades, I know it's not easy. And, while reading these chapters, Dr. Ankita has very nicely summarized this whole book. When I, read chapters starting with the whole concept of Europe, which what Professor Bhattacharya has written, what is Europe? And then the genesis and the evolution of the European Union. It's explanations about or descriptions about its institutions and main EU policies. And also a chapter on the EU as an international actor. When I was reading, these chapters, you could feel that you are actually sitting in his class and listening to his lectures. I was never his student. When he was in JNU, I joined much later as a student also here. I interacted with him mainly, during all the conferences in the last 10-15 years. So in fact, I could feel the book is not really a product of the work of the last 2 or 3 years. Now this is Professor Bhattacharya's lifetime work on Europe, which he was able to put together in some of those chapters. To me, as a student of European studies, this is his very solid contribution. I have read many of textbooks on EU's evolution, its institutions and policies, because this is what we teach here and this is what our job is. But the way I think Professor Bhattacharya has explained many of these long and complicated details in a very simple and systematic manner, I think they are amazing. And I think this is only possible, or this was only possible because he was teaching a course on Europe for many years at Jadavpur. So if you have been, following certain details for the last 20, 30 years and updating your knowledge every year, you can really dig some important milestones in any kind of narrative. And I think this is what I find so amazing in some of these chapters. Somebody might find that these chapters might be, basic introduction about the European integration project. But no, I think this is much more than that, because what I could really feel, like when he's narrating about European history, in a couple of 3 or 4 pages, I think he covered a couple of centuries, and this he only a person of his stature or his capability or understanding could do that. The same thing I think he has also done in all the chapters concerning European, all the integration, couple of 3, 4 chapters and the policies. So last 20, 30 years, which are the major milestones, which are the things which happened? Since I think he has been teaching this for many years, he was able to just sit and write. He has also written, as of course, all of you have mentioned, chapters on contemporary issues concerning major challenges. Just before many of these challenges started appearing in Europe in the last 10, 12 years, and now for the last 10 years, it has also become fashionable to some extent to write of EU. But we also must remember that EU is still one of the largest economies in the world, even without Britain. And the productivity levels are pretty high. They have also built huge capacities in many areas, and in some of the global challenges like climate change, I think EU and its member states, they do play a very, very important role. And just, I think if you look back, 20, 25 years ago, and some of those things have been also been mentioned very clearly by Professor Bhattacharya in some of these chapters. Europe did implement 2 very successful projects. First, they had enlargement, which started, from mid-90s, and then ultimately when, 10 members from the Central Eastern Europe became member of the EU in 2004, and then in 2006, and then later on. Then, of course, the introduction of single currency, the euro. Before they were hit by euro crisis in 2008-9, I think for many, many years, euro was seen as a very, very successful project, not just in Europe, but also in many other parts of the world. And in fact, many other regions wanted to kind of replicate some of those policies. But yes, as now we see, and I think Professor Bhattacharya has also in his chapters on challenges or turmoil or something what he mentioned, you have a very serious crisis, or in fact, some people call it the mother of all the crises, what you can see today is the sovereign debt crisis or the euro crisis which happened in Europe. Yes, after I think 2014-15, when Mario Draghi became, when Mario Draghi came out of the European Central Bank, played very important role when Mario Draghi said that we will save the euro whatever it takes. They have been able to stabilize to some extent this issue, but I think some of the fundamental issues, whether you can continue to have one kind of monetary policy, or at least definitely one monetary policy for 19 member states. At the same time, all 27 or 28 earlier fiscal policies. Now, that fundamental question still, I think Europe has not been able to resolve. The second issue, which he has again mentioned about, which we are all familiar with, the refugee crisis or migration crisis. But what we see today, I mean, people have been coming to Europe. Definitely, not going into long history, but at least after the Second World War, there have been the kind of demography we have in Europe. Europe will continue to need people from outside. Yes, in 2015-16 numbers were pretty high, but after that the numbers have come down significantly. Now numbers are pretty manageable, but at the same time, even if this is not really an economic problem at that sense, but politically, I think the issue has not gone. And the rise of all these right-wing political parties in Europe, they keep using this particular issue, because this is the way they have really expanded in the last few years while using some of these kind of issues. So it may not be a major economic issue now, but still politically, the issue is very much alive. And this is also very much linked with security issues and the kind of terrorist incidents which is seen in the last many years in many of the major cities. And then again, Professor Bhattacharya has also wrote very clearly about the kind of tensions EU or some of the European countries have now with Russia. Throughout the 90s, you can see Russia was one of their strategic partners, and they were able to build very useful kind of partnership during those years. But now Russia may not be enemy of Europe, but obviously it's not a strategic partner anymore. So the kind of issues Europe facing, all the challenges. And then you also have I think Professor Bhattacharya has also brought the issue of climate change, and then, which of course is a politically very much a live issue, and Europe would like to play kind of a leadership role here. Now, the point has also been mentioned about chapter on, there is a full-fledged chapter on the India-EU, which Professor Bhattacharya has written. He has given all the extensive details of this, and he has explained how developments, in fact, interesting part of this chapter for me is because, we are quite familiar what is happening between India and the European Union. When we started, summit meetings in 2000 and after when we had 2004 strategic partnership, and since then joint action plan and, starting of FTA negotiations in 2007. And then now more recently, the action plan, which was agreed, and in between also there was another action plan a couple of years ago. So those details are to some extent, I think, are quite well known. But what is really interesting to me in this chapter is that, historically, because, the advantage of Professor Bhattacharya is that, unlike some of us, those who have started following in the last 15-20 years, he has been following many of these details, maybe for the last 40-45 years. So he was able to actually dig some of those issues which many of us were not fully aware. So it was quite interesting to see how when India and Europe started coming together, or when India actually, when UK became part of EEC, then what kind of reaction we had in India. So I think that these are again some of the useful things which one can see in the chapter. And he is also quite categorical that India and the EU FTA would booster ties from both the countries. Now, but at the same time, Professor Bhattacharya has also reminded us, not directly in the chapter on India and the EU, but on the chapter on I think on the foreign policy, that the kind of main objectives of European foreign policy, from where it started. Later on, of course, many other issues also were added into this, but it started with democracy, human rights, and rule of law. So if we are trying to have a very strong kind of partnership with EU, then we cannot really brush aside the issues concerning democracy or human rights or labor standards or sustainability or environment, because these are the kind of key issues which are at the heart of many of the EU institutions. And this also, to some extent, explains why sometimes things become more difficult. Even if you look at India-EU FTA negotiations, this is, there is a mandate from the European Parliament that any FTA which EU is going to negotiate or going to kind of conclude will have a reference to human rights and reference to labor standards and reference to sustainability. Now, how do we say that we want to have an FTA with the EU, but we are quite allergic to some of these things entered into this. So we have to really understand the way EU institutions function, and I also follow very closely what is happening between China and the European Union, and I find it's quite remarkable that the way Chinese have been able to understand EU, and the way they have invested in their own universities and think tanks to understand EU and its institution and the functioning, and accordingly they are kind of managing their policies, because for them also Europe is very, very important partner, and this also has to some extent the way it is reflected now when China has been able to kind of sign investment agreement with the EU, but still we are, since 2007 we are negotiating, and since 2013, of course, negotiations are frozen. Now there is, of course, also a chapter on Brexit, where he has written. I said earlier, he's one of the, he was one of the authorities on Brexit, because his main, in fact, core of his interest within the European studies and EU study was British entry into, the way, because many of us looking started things, what is happening in the last 5 years, but I think he has been following those details for the last 40 years or so. So he has concluded in this chapter that perhaps the Britain has finally decided what kind of role it wants for itself in Europe and also in the world. And he also perhaps concluded that now this presents a new opportunity for India to renew its ties with the UK and also with the EU. But in fact, this was one chapter where I thought maybe I expected slightly more from Professor Bhattacharya, particularly in the concluding portion, because the way later on he kind of concluded, because this is the subject which I know that he was researching for the last 4 or 5 years. He has given very full details of things, description of the things happening, but how India should be really looking towards a new EU minus Britain, and then also how do we really renew our relationship with UK. In fact, I think he just concluded the thing saying that this presents opportunities and challenges, this also presents opportunities and challenges for them, perhaps without really specifying things, what are those opportunities and what are those kind of challenges. But of course, this is a very useful chapter, Brexit. And the last concluding chapter, which Dr. Ankita has concluded all the stuff, but again, one would have expected slightly more, but maybe in fact, as Professor Chatterjee has also mentioned, maybe this was the time when he was perhaps not, his physical conditions perhaps was not fully, he was not able to devote too much time perhaps here. But one conclusion, as was narrated earlier, that EU is at the crossroad today, but he doesn't feel that there is any existential threat to the EU. And EU has seen, as he said, many ups and downs, and it will muddle through. We know that, and I think these are right conclusions. There is nothing really fundamentally wrong, because yes, the EU is at the crossroads and there have been ups and downs, and one has also seen that EU has muddled through many of those crises before. But I think the basic fundamental challenge which Europe is facing today, yes, there are all these serious challenges or difficulty EU is and what in the last 10-15 years, all kind of solutions which have come from EU institutions in a different way. I mean, whether these are plans or these are strategies or these are actually programs or everything, whatever you can, or even their statements or their, I mean, they are basically looking for more and more Europe. In a sense that if you have a crisis in the Eurozone, you are looking for common euro bonds, you are looking for more, fiscal coordination, you are looking for many those or the kind of policies which will have more integration projects. Similarly, when you are looking for, solutions of, a refugee or migration crisis, so you are looking for European solutions in a sense where there has to be more integration, more role of the bureaucracy within the EU. If you had all kind of solutions of all problems, you would see with more Europe, more integration. Now, to some extent, many argue that the last 10 years of different crises have also given those new opportunities for new projects, because after Lisbon Treaty, there wasn't much talk of any other major projects, but these kind of crises have now, they have already, implemented the banking union. They are talking about so many, the countries which have not joined Eurozone, they should join as quickly as possible, expanding the Schengen area, etc. But at the same time, there is a problem now, because many of the countries which were very enthusiastic at one point of time within the EU now, particularly countries of Central and Eastern Europe, I'm referring to countries like Poland, Hungary, and to some extent even Czech Republic, etc. Now, they are not really so enthusiastic about some of those more integration projects. And there is also certain anti kind of EU feeling you could see through many of these right-wing parties throughout Western Europe as well. So yes, EU institutions are coming with more Europe kind of projects, but appetite for those kind of, further integration projects is not there what it used to be before the collapse of the Soviet Union, or even after that in the 90s, when Germany also used to play a very important role in those integration projects because, for their own integration, etc. But now that appetite is not there. So what kind of solution they will have?
Professor Sachdeva, can I request you to wind up in a couple of minutes, please?
Thank you. So, so this is what perhaps I think we need perhaps more discussion, what kind of solutions Europe, for the kind of challenges Europe is facing. Of course, it's not going to wither away, but what is really we are looking for. So at the end, I'm really thankful to now ICWA for encouraging Professor Bhattacharya to write this book. Now, Professor Bhattacharya is not with us, but just before he left, I think he was able to share some of his knowledge on Europe and European studies on EU and Brexit, etc. with us. We are really indebted to both to Professor Bhattacharya and to ICWA, because if maybe, at that point of time, of course, we didn't know that Bhattacharya will not be with us, after 2 years or 3 years. But if he was not actually doing this project and this book, all this kind of knowledge which was there with Professor Bhattacharya, we would have lost. And many of those chapters, particularly on the European integration initial chapters, I find very, very useful for all of us students, those who are going to read. So from Indian perspective, how somebody is really looking at the European project. And I think this is a very useful thing, useful book, and which will continue to inspire many other scholars in European studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachdeva. Now I'd like to, I was looking at the chat box. I don't find any questions there, but I would like to lob a few questions to you. And if I may also to Professor Majumdar, because he's been listening very patiently. But let me begin with Professor Chatterjee. Shibashis, you probably were listening to Professor Sachdeva when he spent quite a bit of time on the question of Brexit and the likely impact on the integration of the European Union. Now, you also mentioned that when you were speaking. Now, the UK has about 20% of the GDP of the European Union before it left. It's also, of course, a considerably large country in Europe population-wise, also a member of the Security Council, and also, of course, a nuclear weapon country, though that may not be so significant in this context. But I'd like to ask you, do you see prospects of integration moving faster or slower with the departure of Britain? And I may request everybody just to take 2 or 3 minutes in replying so that we can get through more of these questions in the discussion. Thank you. Professor Chatterjee.
Thank you, Ambassador Srinivasan.
By the way, we've noted your disclaimer, so you can be you can be as frivolous as you wish.
No, I mean, I would be true to the disclaimer that I think I issued right at the outset. Okay, I mean, so, let me, allow myself to be a bit personal, okay, here, because of the fact that I've had some of these discussions with Professor Bhattacharya just before the time that things actually turned horribly wrong. To complement what Gulshan in fact was saying, that this book would have looked a bit different, Gulshan, if Professor Bhattacharya had the help. So his original planning actually was a bit different, okay, and he actually thought about revisiting the Brexit chapter substantively, but unfortunately he just couldn't do because his health in fact would not permit. So in a sense, I think this is a point which I think is there for the taking, which is that what is the relationship what is the relationship between the European Union and Britain? Okay, I mean, once Britain fully exits, and it's not there, would it really have any negative impact so far as the pace of integration is concerned and the quality of integration? Or actually, it might in a way sort of facilitate. If you ask me, I mean, I don't know how Professor Bhattacharya in fact would answer. I think he was deeply anguished by the fact that Brexit happened. Okay, I mean, he told me on numerous times that this would be one of the worst, I think, takeaways in his own life, that he would see Britain in fact pulling out of the European Union. But if you ask me, I think European Union is a more integrated body without Britain. And I think if the European Union in fact is able to manage the peripheral, I think, challenges a bit efficaciously better, which is with regard to the challenges posed by the newer countries and who in fact are not happy with the way in which the demands of integration in fact are posed, primarily because of the ascension of a particular form of politics than anything else, as I see it. Now, if European Union in fact is able to manage this challenge, I think the pace of integration in fact is not really going to be affected to a large extent, let's say, or decisively by the exit of Britain. Britain would have more problems by being outside the European Union in the days to come. It remains to be seen how the British in fact would manage things. I mean, so not every major state in fact is a part of a major union, let's say, or a major institutional contraption in order to affect its decisions and to steer policy in various, I would say, domains of life. So I think if you look closely to Britain, well, it had moments when it was not a part of the European Union. It still had major challenges to national security and to economic security. Then it was a part of the European experiment through phases, and I think it never really had a smooth sailing. Okay, as a part of the European narrative, it had its own problems, on and off. Now it's outside the European frameworks, so the problems in fact would remain. Okay, I mean, I don't think there is going to be any fundamental, I would say, difference to the problem. So whether you were looking at the Russian challenge the geopolitical challenge coming from Russia, or you were looking at energy crisis, or you were looking at the issues of climate, or plain economic regeneration, let's say, okay, I mean, if you take it directly. So these challenges, in fact, I don't see them causal to either to the European experimentation or to the denouement, okay, in the form of Brexit. I don't see them as causal. So
right. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, we'll have to see how these things go.
Professor Majumdar, you've been very patient with us. Can I just ask you what you feel about European representation in various international organizations? You probably know that before Brexit, the population of the European Union was around 10% of the world population. Now, I don't know what it is now, but let's assume as a ballpark, it might be around 8%. The individual European states, apart from the EU, have representation. For example, I mentioned the UN and I mentioned the G20. In the G20, there are 20% of the entire 20 members there. Apart from that, individual European countries are really in a very prominent voting position in the IMF and the World Bank. Do you think that this imbalance needs to be corrected, and the sooner the better? I'm afraid you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. I would take it as a kind of general question of international affairs rather than, especially pertaining to, European Union or the members of the European Union. One reason is that I am really no expert on, Europe. And the other reason is that neither I am very much, involved with studies of international organizations. But within my limitations, I would try to respond to this question in this fashion that, corrections in international politics doesn't take place on the basis of certain accepted principles or some kind of value judgments. It depends on the kind of evolution of international affairs that results in some kind of formation of organizations and membership of those organizations. And eventually, other powers might come up and other powers might replace those or sideline those in terms of their impact. That happens. And how do we correct this kind of imbalance? Quoting you, in fact, the idea is that the other powers, if they come up with their military and economic might, immediately what would happen is that some kind of change in global power equations would take place, and that would ensure new organizations, new memberships for old organizations, and things would thereby, I would not say that would be a perfect situation, but things would thereby change and evolve, and you would find a new kind of world. Another aspect I would just mention here, that in contemporary period, we find once again reassertion of territories, geographies, identity politics, whatever you call it, and in fact, I am under the impression that is not very good for integration of states in contemporary period. The situation might change in future. There could be ups and downs, and it would be some kind of down situation for the time being. So, that would be my general observation. I am not sure whether that would satisfy you, but that is what my understanding is.
Thank you very much. It fully satisfies me. Now, Professor Sachdeva, you remember the strategic partnership which started in 2004 between India and the EU, the EU has these strategic partnerships also with Japan, China, and South Korea, very major economic entities. India also, of course, has tremendous promise and may well be in that league sooner rather than later. But do you see that the strategic partnership has actually evolved in something bilaterally useful, or does it need reinvigoration?
Well, one is that, of course, in the last few years, what has happened is, we have moved into many new areas which we were not thinking earlier that it is possible to do certain things with Europe because of, competences are limited as far as EU is concerned in those areas. But the fact of the matter is that the core of our relationship is still economics. And main competencies of the EU is also in trade and investment matters. Of course, you can talk about maritime security, you can talk about Indo-Pacific, you can talk about all other kind of issues. But within those areas, you can get certain statements from EU, certain declarations maximum, but that's it. And beyond that, EU cannot do much. So unless we are really able to move very significantly on trade and investment issues, I think we will have a problem. Of course, if this is not happening, then there are many other areas from renewables to, we can talk about, and there'll be, or connectivity particularly. You can do certain kind of partnerships in those areas, but the core is still, trade, and I think, so something really need to have significantly on the FTA front, which unfortunately has stuck for last many years and very little chance of moving further.
Thank you very much. Just a quick couple of quick questions from the chat box. I think I'll take the general one to Professor Chatterjee. Professor Chatterjee, considering the advances by Russia on Ukraine, does the EU have the capability of coming together, or is it likely to further disintegrate? A quick reply, please.
I think it's possibly the better institutional, organ to look at. In fact, it's a response by the NATO rather than the European Union. I do not think that the rise in Russian power, in fact, is going to have any direct implication, let's say, to the integration process. I don't think there is any causal ties. I am firmly of the opinion that the challenges to the integration would basically be what Professor Sachdeva in fact had indicated, which is the lateral pressure coming from the new entrants. Now, if there is a fault line developing there, then one doesn't exactly know whether the EU in fact would have the capability to respond to meaningfully to assuaging that fault line. I do not think that the rise of Russia itself in fact is going to have any deleterious impact on the integration process. In the contrary, if you follow a comparative political sociology of institutional, I would say, cooperation, then you find that the rise of a common threat, in fact, has often strengthened integration processes. And therefore, the rise of Europe, in fact, the rise of Russia, therefore, could, in a way, provide an opportunity for the European Union, in fact, to reinvent itself. Reinventing the wheel kind of a thing.
Of course, this kind of presupposes that Russia has no locus standi in Ukraine. But let's leave that one aside. That's a much bigger question.
Yeah.
Professor Sachdeva, the other question here, which is, I think, right up your street, with the EU and Chinese sanctions on each other, what is the scope of the investment agreement being passed by the European Parliament?
Well, my personal feeling is that, these sanctions, yes, these limited sanctions on each other. Now, EU and China are very deeply engaged economically with each other. And if you look at figures, they exchange goods and services of worth $2 billion every day, apart from other things which are happening between these two countries. And this particularly investment agreement has been backed by all 27 countries and very strongly backed by Germany and France. Yes, for the next 1 year, there'll be a lot of talk within the EU institutions about certain human rights issues, about democracy and all these issues. They have been playing this game for many, many years. And my personal feeling is that ultimately it will be passed. There won't be any. I mean, there will be some statements here and there for the, for kind of to raise those issues, but ultimately it will be passed.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear and concise answer. Now I think we're just on time, so Ankita will cue me in to say a few words to close this discussion. So, but let me just confine my closing remarks to India and Europe. The Asian spending power and the two-way FDI is going to rise sharply. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The per capita disparity with Europe, between Europe and India that is going to result in acute price sensitivity in the Indian market. The implication of this on European manufacture and services is extremely important, but has not yet been studied adequately either here in India or in Europe. In its own interest, India should maximize its relations with the EU. India enjoys brand recognition in Europe and holds a certain position in soft power and in economic potential. There is no EU resistance to these. Europe is a continent of prosperity, despite its manifold problems, with very high standards of living, and is the biggest unified consumer market in the world, which makes it attractive for Indian high-end goods and services. But India must strive to meet European standards so that the predominance of services in our export basket is mitigated. As a source of technology and expertise in all fields of human enterprise, Europe is a desirable destination for Indian investments, as well as skilled immigrants, professionals, and higher studies. Europe is not threatening and does not feel threatened by India. It is non-intrusive and can enhance India's global status. India must avoid obsessing about EU links with Pakistan and China. It should not overreact to European critiques of democratic standards, social structures, and human rights, since those criticisms, firstly, are valid, and secondly, are well-intentioned. If India seeks a future multipolar world, then India and Europe should constitute two of those poles. Just a very gentle word of advice to the ICWA as the publisher. For a book of this kind, an index and a list of abbreviations are essential, and a map is also desirable. I know you have your limitations, and I know the publisher also has a say, but as a co-publisher, I'd be grateful if you could understand my comments in the right spirit. I'd like to thank the ICWA very much and Mrs. Ankita Dutta for having put this program together. And of course, Professor Anindya Majumdar, Professor Shibashis Chatterjee, and Professor Gulshan Sachdeva for their really excellent contributions to this discussion. So Ankita, it's over to you.
Thank you, sir. With this, we have come to an end of our book discussion. I take this opportunity to thank all our chair, panelists and participants for their time and attention. Thank you, and we look forward to you joining us in our upcoming events. Thank you very much. Good evening.